presentation skills that keep students engaged. Several months had passed since Sarah taught her first class, and she had become much more comfortable standing in front of a room full of students. Her lessons were organized, her classroom was prepared, and she no longer felt nervous when introducing a new topic. Yet something still wasn't quite right. After class, David asked, "How do you think it went?" "I covered everything I planned," Sarah replied. "Everyone seemed to understand the material." David nodded. "They understood it." He paused for a moment. But were they engaged? Sarah thought back over the morning. During the first hour, students were asking questions and participating in discussions. By the second hour, fewer hands were raised. After lunch, several students appeared tired, and one student had spent more time looking at a phone than looking at the presentation. "The information didn't change," Sarah said. "No," David replied, "but your delivery did." That conversation taught Sarah one of the most valuable lessons of her teaching career. A great presentation isn't measured by how much information is delivered. It's measured by how effectively the instructor keeps students interested from beginning to end. Every instructor has attended classes where the material was excellent, yet the presentation made it difficult to stay focused. The instructor rarely looked up from the slides, spoke in the same tone for an hour, and never varied the pace of the lesson. Students may have remained physically present, but mentally they checked out long before the class ended. Outstanding instructors understand that their voice is one of the most powerful teaching tools they possess. Speaking too quickly can overwhelm students, while speaking too slowly can cause attention to drift. Changing your pace, emphasizing important words, and occasionally pausing before making an important point naturally encourages students to stay engaged. Silence, when used intentionally, can be just as effective as speaking. Body language communicates just as much as words. Students notice whether an instructor appears confident, approachable, and enthusiastic. Standing with good posture, smiling naturally, and using purposeful gestures reinforce your message without becoming distracting. On the other hand, repeatedly pacing the room, crossing your arms, or constantly looking at the computer screen can unintentionally shift students' attention away from the lesson. Sarah also discovered that movement has a purpose. Early in her teaching career, she stood behind the podium almost the entire class because it felt comfortable. David encouraged her to move with intention instead of remaining in one place. Walking towards students while asking a question, stepping to the whiteboard to illustrate a concept, or moving closer during a classroom discussion helped create energy without becoming distracting. Purposeful movement made the classroom feel more conversational and less like a lecture. One day, David asked Sarah to record herself teaching. She wasn't excited about the idea. After watching the recording, she immediately noticed something she had never realized. She ended nearly every sentence with the phrase, "Okay?" She also said far more often than she imagined. Most instructors develop small speaking habits without realizing it. Words such as you know, basically, or okay can become verbal distractions when repeated throughout a presentation. Students often notice these habits before instructors do. Recording yourself occasionally is one of the best ways to identify and improve those patterns. Sarah also learned that humor, when used appropriately, could transform a classroom. Sharing a funny but relevant story about a real estate transaction often relaxed the room and helped students remember important concepts. However, David reminded her that humor should never embarrass students, offend others, or distract from the lesson. The goal is to build relationships, not become a comedian. Perhaps the greatest presentation skill Sarah developed was storytelling. Instead of reading definitions from a slide, she began introducing legal concepts through real Arizona situations involving buyers, sellers, brokers, inspectors, and escrow officers. Students naturally became curious about what would happen next, and as the story unfolded, the legal principles became much easier to understand. Stories gave students context, helped them remember complex information, and encouraged classroom discussion because many could relate the situations to their own experiences. Maintaining attention during a 3-hour class also required variety. Sarah realized that students didn't lose focus because the material wasn't important. They lost focus when the presentation never changed. She began alternating between short lectures, stories, contract examples, discussions, review questions, and practical exercises. Every few minutes, students were asked to think, participate, or apply what they had just learned. The classroom became noticeably more energetic because students were involved rather than simply listening. By the end of the semester, Sarah's teaching style had changed dramatically. She no longer measured success by how many slides she completed. She measured success by how many students participated. As they packed up after class, David smiled. "You've stopped giving presentations." Sarah looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "You're creating conversations." She looked back at the classroom. Students were still discussing the day's lesson as they walked toward the parking lot. She smiled. David was right. The most memorable presentations aren't remembered because of perfect slides or polished speeches. They're remembered because students felt involved, stayed engaged, and left the classroom believing they had learned something they could immediately apply. That's the mark of an exceptional instructor, and it's what transforms an ordinary presentation into an outstanding educational experience. Instructor tip: record yourself teaching at least once each year. Watching your own presentation is one of the fastest ways to improve your voice, pacing, body language, classroom movement, and overall teaching effectiveness. Online discussion question 1. Which presentation skill do you believe has the greatest impact on student engagement, and why? Answer: while every presentation skill contributes to effective instruction, maintaining eye contact, varying vocal delivery, using storytelling, and encouraging participation often have the greatest impact because they keep students actively involved throughout the lesson instead of passively listening. Question 2. Why is storytelling such an effective teaching strategy in real estate education? Answer: stories provide context for legal concepts, help students relate classroom material to actual transactions, and improve long-term retention. Real-world examples also encourage discussion because students can connect the lesson to experiences they have encountered or may encounter in practice. Question 3. How can instructors identify habits that may distract students during a presentation? First, observe student reactions and note when attention wanes. Next, ask for feedback and be aware of verbal and nonverbal cues. Finally, adjust pacing, visuals, and content accordingly. Answer: recording classroom presentations allows instructors to observe their pacing, body language, speaking habits, classroom movement, and overall delivery. Self-evaluation helps instructors recognize distracting behaviors they may not notice while teaching.